A U.S. museum spent millions of dollars to own a piece of the oldest religious texts on Earth. They built a $500 million building around them. They put them behind reinforced glass, under climate control, guarded like national treasures. For years, visitors stood in front of these fragments believing they were looking at 2,000-year-old pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then, a small team of forensic scientists got permission to look closer than anyone ever had. And what they found didn't just embarrass a museum, it exposed one of the most sophisticated deceptions in the history of biblical archaeology. In 2017, in the heart of Washington, D.C., just a few blocks from the Smithsonian, a new museum opened its doors. It was called the Museum of the Bible, and it was the vision of Steve Green, president of the retail chain Hobby Lobby. The Green family had spent roughly $500 million building what they wanted to be the most immersive, most complete telling of the Bible story ever assembled under one roof. Multiple floors, interactive exhibits, ancient artifacts flown in from around the world. But if you're going to build a museum about the Bible, there's one collection you almost have to have: the Dead Sea Scrolls. Discovered starting in 1947 in a set of caves near Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea, the scrolls are considered one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. Roughly 2,000 years old, they include some of the earliest known copies of the Hebrew Bible, along with other religious and community texts from the Jewish sects who lived in that region before and after the time of Jesus. For historians, they aren't just old papers. They're a direct window into how these texts looked before centuries of copying, translation, and interpretation shaped the Bible we know today. The story of how they were found is almost as famous as the scrolls themselves. According to the most widely told version, a young Bedouin shepherd searching for a stray goat threw a stone into a cave opening in the cliffs near Qumran and heard something shatter. Inside, he found clay jars holding leather scrolls that had sat undisturbed in the dry desert air for roughly 2,000 years. Word spread, more caves were searched over the following years, and by the mid-1950s, 11 caves had yielded close to 900 manuscripts, some nearly complete, most in fragments. It remains one of the only times in history that an entire library of ancient religious texts survived largely intact, preserved by the exact dry, stable desert conditions that usually destroy organic material like leather and parchment within a few centuries. It's worth understanding why scholars and collectors get so obsessive over new scroll fragments in the first place. The Dead Sea Scrolls didn't just confirm the Bible's ancient text. In places, they revealed how much biblical wording had shifted during the centuries of hand copying that followed. The newly surfaced, previously undocumented fragment carries the tantalizing possibility of an even earlier or slightly different version of a familiar passage, the kind of find that can genuinely reshape a footnote in every future study Bible. For the Museum of the Bible specifically, owning real scroll material wasn't just a nice exhibit piece. It was meant to be physical proof connecting everything else in the building, the printing presses, the illuminated manuscripts, the modern translations, back to an unbroken chain reaching all the way to the ancient world. Losing that piece wouldn't just mean losing 16 small scraps of leather. It would mean losing the anchor the entire museum's narrative had been built around. Here's the problem for anyone who wants to personally own a piece of that story. Almost none of it is actually for sale. The overwhelming majority of genuine Dead Sea Scrolls are held by the Israeli government and displayed at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, protected as a national treasure. They don't go up for auction. They don't quietly change hands between private collectors. If you're a wealthy museum founder and you want your own physical fragment to put behind glass, there's essentially one place left to look: a small, murky private market of fragments with no verified excavation history, fragments that mysteriously started surfacing sometime after the year 2002. Steve Green bought 16 of them through a series of private dealers over several years. At first, everything seemed to check out. In 2016, a team of respected biblical scholars published a full academic study of 13 of the fragments, treating them as genuine pieces of history worth serious scholarly attention. When the Museum of the Bible opened in 2017, the scrolls were one of its headline attractions. Visitors from around the world lined up to see, with their own eyes, physical fragments of the very scrolls they'd read about in textbooks. Nobody in that opening week crowd knew they were looking at something else entirely. At the time, the museum itself didn't know it either, or at least, it wasn't saying so publicly. The fragments had passed through respected hands, been examined by respected scholars, and been presented to the public with total institutional confidence. On paper, it looked like one of the great private acquisitions in the history of biblical archaeology, a newly built, extraordinarily well-funded museum in the U.S. Capitol, holding what appeared to be a genuine slice of the most famous archaeological discovery connected to the Bible. It was the kind of story that wrote itself for a grand opening. What nobody involved seemed to fully reckon with in that moment was a question a handful of outside scholars had already started quietly asking: Where exactly had all these new Dead Sea Scroll fragments been hiding for the better part of 2,000 years? And why had so many of them suddenly appeared on the private market at almost exactly the same time? The Dead Sea Scrolls were, by the early 2000s, one of the most thoroughly studied archaeological collections on the planet. Every known fragment from the original 1940s and 1950s excavations at Qumran had already been catalogued, published, and pored over by generations of scholars. So when a new wave of previously unknown fragments began quietly surfacing on the private antiquities market sometime after 2002 with no excavation records, no documented chain of custody, no clear explanation of where they'd been for 2 millennia, it should have set off alarm bells immediately. For a while, it mostly didn't. The demand for anything connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls was enormous among both serious scholars and wealthy private collectors. Museums and universities around the world acquired their own so-called post-2002 fragments, the Museum of the Bible among them. Some scholars raised early concerns about the handwriting on a few pieces, letter forms that didn't quite match known ancient scribal conventions, breaks and edges that looked strangely clean for something supposedly torn 2,000 years ago. But without hard scientific testing, these were educated hunches, not proof. By the time the Museum of the Bible was assembling its own collection, researchers tracking this market had already identified roughly 70 separate post-2002 fragments scattered across university archives, private collections, and museums around the world, every one of them lacking the kind of excavation paperwork that legitimate Dead Sea Scroll material has always had. A small number of specialist scholars, working almost entirely outside the spotlight, had begun quietly cataloging these fragments and flagging inconsistencies years before anyone commissioned a single lab test. Their concerns were largely overlooked, in part because so many respected institutions had already staked their reputations and their money on these pieces being genuine. There was also a simpler, more human reason doubts took so long to surface. Nearly everyone with the expertise to spot a forgery also had a strong personal or professional incentive to want the fragments to be real. Scholars who got early access to study new fragments could publish groundbreaking research. Institutions that acquired them got a marquee exhibit and a powerful fundraising story. Collectors got bragging rights over one of the rarest categories of object in the world. None of that makes anyone a co-conspirator, but it helps explain why a market flooded with unverified, undocumented fragments kept finding eager buyers for the better part of 2 decades before anyone ran the physical evidence through a lab capable of actually settling the question. The incentive to believe was, in a very real sense, working against the incentive to double-check. That started to change as the Museum of the Bible prepared for its grand opening. In 2017, journalists covering the museum's launch began asking pointed questions about where exactly its scroll fragments had come from and whether the museum had done enough due diligence before buying them. The museum's answer, in effect, was that its fragments had been vetted by respected outside scholars. But vetted by scholars and scientifically tested are 2 very different standards, and the gap between them was about to matter enormously. In October 2018, the museum took its first real step toward finding out which one applied. It sent 5 of its 16 fragments to an independent German research institute for laboratory analysis. The result came back blunt. The 5 fragments tested showed, in the institute's own words, characteristics inconsistent with an ancient origin. In plain terms, they looked fake. The museum pulled all 5 from display immediately and admitted, publicly, that at least part of its prized collection wasn't what it claimed to be. But that admission created a much bigger, much harder question than it answered. If 5 out of 16 were forgeries, what about the other 11? Had the museum simply gotten unlucky with a handful of bad purchases from an otherwise legitimate market, or was something much larger going on? The 11 remaining fragments stayed on public display, and for nearly 2 more years, the museum's leadership found itself in an uncomfortable position, publicly committed to the possibility that the rest of its collection was genuine, while privately aware that the confidence behind that claim had just taken a serious hit. By this point, it was clear that the people the museum had originally relied on, biblical scholars, historians, textual experts, weren't the right specialists to settle this. Reading ancient Hebrew script is one skill. Detecting a deliberately engineered forgery built specifically to fool historians is a completely different one. So the museum did something it probably should have done years earlier. It brought in a team that didn't specialize in the Bible at all. It brought in a team that specialized in catching fraud. Before we get into exactly how they cracked this, because the forensic method here is genuinely one of the more clever detective stories in recent archaeology. If you're into this kind of deep dive into the hidden, uncomfortable side of history, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's what keeps this channel able to keep making them. The museum commissioned a full, independent, top-to-bottom investigation of all 16 fragments, led by Colette Lall, founder of a firm called Art Fraud Insights. Lawl's entire career had been built around one specialty, figuring out how forgers fool experts and then proving it with hard physical evidence. Her team spent roughly 2 years running the fragments through a battery of tests. Most biblical scholars had never had access to high-resolution, three-dimensional digital microscopy, scanning electron microscopes, multispectral imaging, and microchemical and elemental analysis of the materials themselves. The first thing they needed to establish was simple. What physically are these fragments actually made of? Genuine Dead Sea Scrolls, almost without exception, are written on parchment, animal skin that's been treated, scraped, and prepared in a very specific way. Under a microscope, prepared parchment has a distinct fiber and collagen structure that's essentially impossible to fake convincingly once you know what you're looking for. So the team put the museum's fragments under exactly that kind of magnification. What they found surprised even the investigators. Several of the fragments weren't parchment at all. They were leather, an old leather at that, just not the right kind of old. The material's structure was consistent with something like ancient shoe or sandal leather, possibly Roman era, repurposed and reshaped to resemble scroll fragments. To the naked eye, aged leather and aged parchment look almost identical. Under a scanning electron microscope, the difference is obvious. That single discovery reframed the entire case. This wasn't a story about someone finding genuinely ancient scroll material and simply attaching fake text to boost its value. This was something more calculated. Whoever made these fragments appears to have deliberately sourced old but scroll-irrelevant leather, specifically because it was old. Aged material would pass a casual, is this actually ancient, sniff test. A forger banking on nobody looking too closely at the base material almost got away with it. The ink told an even more damning story. On a genuine ancient manuscript, ink, applied 2,000 years ago, has had 2,000 years to interact with the surface, soaking into fibers, aging and degrading in step with the material underneath it, sitting beneath layers of natural surface crust and grime that accumulated slowly over centuries. On the Museum of the Bible's fragments, the investigators found the opposite pattern. In multiple places, the ink sat on top of that surface crust and contamination rather than underneath it, a strong sign that the writing had been added long after the material had already aged, not 2,000 years ago alongside it. In some spots, the ink had cracked and pooled in ways consistent with a substance drying quickly on an already old surface, not the slow, even penetration you'd expect from genuine ancient ink. Put those two findings together and a picture starts to form. Someone, or some small group of someones, got their hands on scraps of genuinely old leather. Not scroll material, just old leather, likely dug up from an unrelated archaeological context. They shaped it, aged its edges further to look consistent with scroll fragments, and then wrote invented or copied Hebrew text on it, using techniques and inks designed to mimic ancient scribal work as closely as possible. It's a forgery built specifically to survive a surface-level authenticity check, because the base material really was ancient, just not ancient in the way anyone assumed. The team didn't stop at microscopes and ink. They also ran elemental analysis on the material itself, checking mineral content and trace chemical signatures against fragments from the verified, undisputed Qumran collection. Genuine scroll material carries a chemical fingerprint tied to the specific geology and climate of the caves where it sat for 2,000 years. The museum's fragments didn't match that fingerprint consistently, another sign that whatever these pieces were, they hadn't spent 2 millennia in the Qumran caves. Fragment by fragment, the investigators built a case file. Some pieces showed ink bridging directly across pre-existing cracks in the leather. Physically impossible if the writing had been added before the material aged and split, but exactly what you'd expect if someone wrote on leather that was already old, dry, and cracked by the time a pen touched it. Other fragments showed traces of modern adhesive, apparently used to help hold crumbling material together during the forgery process itself. No single clue, on its own, would have been enough to make the case. Repeated across fragment after fragment, together they added up to a pattern no honest explanation could account for. On March 13, 2020, at a conference in Washington that had to be scaled back because of the pandemic, Lawl's team released their full findings, a 200-page report covering every fragment in the collection. The conclusion was unambiguous. Every single one of the 16 fragments the Museum of the Bible had spent years defending as genuine pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls was a modern forgery. Not most of them, not the disputed ones. All 16 deliberately manufactured sometime in the 20th century with the specific intent to pass as authentic ancient artifacts. 2 years of doubt, a $500 million museum, 16 fragments once treated as a scholarly milestone, and under a microscope, none of it was real. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable in a different way. Because the investigation that proved the fragments were fake couldn't answer the question everyone immediately wanted answered. Who actually made them? Tracing forgeries back to their source is a different kind of investigation entirely. one that involves following money through a chain of private dealers who, by design, tend not to keep detailed records of where their inventory originally came from. What Law's team could say is that the fragments had passed through a limited number of dealers, all connected to that same murky post-2002 wave of newly surfaced Dead Sea Scroll material. Whoever made these forgeries wasn't working alone or in isolation. They understood ancient Hebrew scribal conventions well enough to imitate them convincingly. They understood forensic dating well enough to specifically avoid the most obvious pitfall, using genuinely old material as their base. This was not an amateur operation, and the Museum of the Bible, it turns out, wasn't the only institution that had been fooled. In the years following this investigation, similar post-2002 fragments held by other universities and private collections around the world came under the same scrutiny, and a number of them were also flagged as likely fakes. Azusa Pacific University in California had bought 5 fragments for roughly $1.3 million. Once independent researchers raised doubts, the university concluded its own pieces were probably not authentic either, and later sued the dealer who had brokered the sale. Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Texas held 8 fragments, purchased in 2012 with help from major donors, specifically eager to bring a piece of the Dead Sea Scrolls into a Christian institution. And the single largest private holder of post-2002 fragments belonged to a Norwegian manuscript collector, whose collection dwarfed even the Museum of the Bibles in sheer fragment count. Across all of these buyers, a pattern repeats: enthusiastic collectors, genuine scholarly or spiritual motivation, and a strikingly small circle of dealers supplying nearly everyone. The Museum of the Bible, to its credit, publicly encouraged every other holder of post-2002 fragments to run the same kind of forensic testing on their own collections. For the institutions involved, this wasn't simply a bad investment story. Many of the buyers were explicitly religious, and the motivation behind these purchases was as much spiritual as scholarly. The desire to hold physically, something that connected their own faith back to its earliest surviving evidence. That emotional stake is likely part of why so few of these fragments were rigorously tested before purchase in the first place. Asking hard forensic questions about a fragment you deeply want to be real is, for almost anyone, an uncomfortable thing to do. The motive underneath all of it isn't complicated. Genuine Dead Sea Scroll material essentially cannot legally enter the private market. It's a protected national treasure, held almost entirely by the Israeli state. But the desire to own a piece of it among wealthy private buyers and ambitious young museums alike never went away. Where legitimate supply is functionally zero and demand is enormous, a black market doesn't just become likely. It becomes close to inevitable. Somewhere, someone recognized that gap and built a small, sophisticated forgery operation to fill it. One convincing enough to fool respected biblical scholars for the better part of a decade. It's also worth saying that this wasn't the Green family's first brush with an antiquities controversy. In 2018, separately from the scroll investigation, Hobby Lobby agreed to return roughly 4,000 looted artifacts, including ancient cuneiform tablets, to Iraq after the U.S. Department of Justice alleged the items had been illegally smuggled into the country. None of that was connected to the forged scroll specifically, but it painted a broader picture of a major, well-funded collector moving fast to acquire rare biblical-era artifacts, sometimes without asking hard enough questions about where they were really coming from. None of this is unique to the Dead Sea Scrolls either. The broader antiquities market has struggled with exactly this problem for decades. Objects with no documented excavation history, sold through private dealers who have every financial incentive not to ask too many questions, bought by institutions that have every emotional incentive not to ask too many questions either. Egyptian artifacts, cuneiform tablets, biblical-era coins, and now Dead Sea Scroll fragments have all passed through versions of the same shadow supply chain. What made this case different is simply that someone finally ran the physical evidence through instruments precise enough to end the debate for good. As for the 16 fake fragments themselves, the museum didn't quietly remove them and pretend the whole episode never happened. It did something more interesting. It kept several of them on public display, rebuilt the accompanying exhibit, and turned the forgeries themselves into the story. An unusually honest example of an institution using its own very public mistake as a teaching moment about how easily even trained experts can be deceived when the incentives to believe are strong enough. Strip away the headlines, and this is a story about a very simple, very old problem. A $500 million museum wanted a piece of one of history's most famous archaeological discoveries badly enough that, for years, showing scholarly approval was treated as good enough proof. It took 2 full years, a specialist in art fraud rather than in the Bible, and forensic tools capable of examining ink at the microscopic level to finally get a real answer. And the twist is that the technology at the center of this story wasn't used to uncover some hidden ancient secret buried in the text itself. It was used to prove the text was never ancient at all. In a niche where new scans and new analysis usually promise to reveal something the ancient world was trying to tell us, this time the reveal was about the present, about how far someone was willing to go and how convincingly they could do it to profit off of humanity's hunger to hold a physical piece of its own oldest stories. It's worth sitting with how long this actually took. Not months, years. Not one test, but dozens, across multiple institutions in multiple countries, requiring specialists who had to be brought in specifically because the usual experts weren't equipped to catch this kind of deception. That's not a knock on the historians and theologians who were fooled first. It's a reminder that expertise in a text and expertise in detecting fraud are simply not the same skill, and that the people most eager to believe something is real are often, unintentionally, the easiest people to convince. It didn't take a criminal mastermind outsmarting the world's top experts at every turn. It took ordinary human hope, combined with a market that had almost no oversight for the better part of 2 decades before anyone thought to demand real proof. If you found this one as unsettling as we did, there's a lot more hiding in plain sight across history like this. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and let us know in the comments which ancient mystery you want cracked open next.